Hello everybody, and welcome to my
super amazing art tour of Destiny.
Today we're going to be looking back through the centuries at several different pieces of art to see how attitudes toward and the purpose of art has changed over time. So let's get into it. This is our first piece for today, The School of Athens, painted by our friend Raphael. This is a Renaissance painting which is placed within the Vatican on a large wall. This painting depicts all of the most notable Greek philosophers, such as Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, Pythagoras, and so on. This follows in the Renaissance tradition of respecting classical art styles, with a very clear structure, great symmetry, and classically styled figures in poses that describe who they are and what they thought. In contrast to earlier medieval works, paintings like this began to use linear perspective and vanishing lines to give an accurate sense of the space that the figures were placed within. This painting shows a great respect for the figures and the ideas of Greek philosophy and the way that they have shaped society, as well as a respect for the great Greek art and architecture. This is the next work that we have, The Calling of St. Matthew by Caravaggio. This is from the later Baroque period where the emphasis was on a lot of action and excitement. You can see we have much more dramatic lighting, more interesting poses, and a bit less structure than earlier Renaissance paintings. One interesting thing about this is even though it's a biblical story, the characters are placed in a setting that would be familiar to viewers in the Baroque era. There's still a great respect for technicalities here, as well as a strong emphasis on the storytelling aspect of this painting and making it aesthetically pleasing. So, Baroque paintings were really exciting, maybe a little too exciting. So neoclassical painters wanted to simplify things a bit and make them a little more clear. This is Napoleon Crossing the St. Bernard by Jacques-Louis David, one of the great neoclassical painters. You can see this painting has a much more simplified style with a pretty plain background and just a central focus on its main characters. It goes back to the classical tradition of idealizing its figures, with the central figure and the horse striking a pose that makes them look very grand as Napoleon leads his troops. Now, as the neoclassical period draws to an end and we start to hit the Industrial Revolution, we're going to see paintings that really emphasize the everyday person and their lives as societies begin to dramatically change. This is The Gleaners by Millet, which shows just three normal people living their lives. In this case, they would be peasants. Millet really wanted to show the heroic life, if you will, of the everyday peasant, who had been overlooked in art before this period. Now, all throughout these first three periods, artists still really respect the traditional styles of classical painting. However, as time goes on and we hit the Industrial Revolution and the introduction of photography, artists start to have to do new things to make their work stand out. One thing that artists begin to focus on is looking at the nature around them and just trying to capture simple moments. And now we get to our first Impressionist painting. This is Impression of a Sunset by Claude Monet. Now, instead of trying to capture every fine detail of his subject, as a photographer already could much better, he instead decides to focus on his impressions of the moment, the area around him, the colors, the reflection of the water, the general form, in an attempt to just seek for the aesthetically beautiful parts of the scenery. And this begins a whole new movement in art, where it is no longer about capturing and representing things, but rather capturing and representing moments in a beautiful way and sharing that. And from Impressionism, we move on to the works of the great Vincent van Gogh, my personal favorite artist. This is The Starry Night, a work which does not attempt at all to depict a realistic version of the night sky that Van Gogh actually sees, but rather it is simply a beautiful image that captures some of his feelings and emotions in the moment that he paints it. And this is the beginning of Expressionism. Art is now about capturing and displaying feelings, and hopefully conveying that to the viewer. And with Expressionism, of course, we have to talk about Munch's The Scream, which is a painting about a guy who is screaming. The story of this is unknown, and that's part of what makes this such an iconic painting. It doesn't aim to capture a moment anymore. Now it's just simply capturing a feeling that everybody has had before, one of anxiety, stress, or fear, with a grotesque central figure whose face is warped in an expression that feels very familiar to anyone looking at this painting. The background is vague, the colors are bright, and the painting is all about this feeling of stress. And now we move on to something else entirely. Oh my, what's that on my staircase? Well, that would be a nude, but not just any nude. This is Nude Descending a Staircase by Marcel Duchamp, who took cubism to its most extreme and wanted to show everything from every angle. The result is pretty completely indecipherable, and its beauty is debatable. However, this shows that art has now taken a form where it's really about experimentation and trying new things, with some interesting results. But if you think this is interesting, you should see Duchamp's next work. This is my reinterpretation of Duchamp's classic piece, The Fountain, which is a statement on how he views art. Now at this point, art has fully gone into what we could call absurdism. Basically, people in the 20th century thought life was absurd, and art reflected that. Now some people consider this to be the most important work of art in the 20th century, and, well, I think that says in of itself a lot about the attitudes surrounding art. No, dang it! And it is during this era that art starts to take some really interesting twists and turns as artists live in a chaotic and ugly world scarred by war, and as a result, they are no longer aiming to capture beauty. Now, from here we move on to another very emotional but very different piece. This is Picasso's Guernica. Now, Picasso had already experimented with and made popular the art form of Cubism, which is a style in which he attempted to show every angle of an object from a single perspective, a very experimental style. Now, Guernica was a response to a horrific bombing of civilians in the early 1900s, and this painting depicts the fear and horror of that moment with a chaotic style that is really hard to look at and decipher, as it doesn't follow a very logical pattern. It is also made entirely in black and white, designed to look like photography in newspapers from that era, where it could also easily be reprinted. Now, this work is intended to capture and display the horror of that moment. So it is emotional, but not in a very positive way, and again, it has that very experimental style. And that concludes our journey through centuries of iconic and influential art. You can see as time has gone on, attitudes towards art and its purpose has dramatically changed. First, we try to represent stories and figures in a sort of grand way, looking back towards ancient styles of art. Then as things continue, we start to capture simple moments and then expressions, feelings, and emotions, and finally, we just start experimenting and doing weird things. Anyway, I'm not an art major, so I hope you enjoyed this. If you did, be sure to smash that like button and subscribe for more content.